This is the invincible Solar Titan build that everyone has been using to solo flawless the brand new dungeon, but it can do so much more than just that. For starters, it'll have you wielding so many buffs that you won't even be able to see all of them on your UI bar.
That's a lot of damage!
Weapon damage boosts, ability damage boosts, constant healing, bursts of healing, fiery super, throwing hammer, punch, hammer, punch, hammer, hammer, sorry. Got a little too excited there, but can you really blame me? Because along with this beautiful build, we've got a Mobalytics guide link down in the description that you can use to reference this guide at any time and optionally pull up as a visual aid as we move through the video. So sit back, relax, subscribe if you love Destiny builds, and let's get rolling. Or perhaps more accurately, let's get throwing, since the bread and butter of this build is our melee ability, the throwing hammer. What you probably already know about it is that it's a throwable object that can hit enemies, be picked up from the ground to fully refund it for use again within 10 seconds, and grants a 65 HP heal when picking it up. But what you might not know about it is that your controller or M&K keybinds are absolutely crucial to using it properly. If you melee through the auto melee setting, the game fights against this build by defaulting to your default melee when close to enemies, even when your throwing hammer is available. You can prevent this, however, by going into your settings and setting your preferred melee key of choice to both charged and uncharged melee. And if you're a controller player, you can do the exact same thing by following the steps shown on screen. The result is that if your charged melee is available and you press the melee button, it will throw your hammer every single time without fail, while using your uncharged melee if your hammer is not available. Now, this throwing hammer might not seem incredibly impressive on its own, but this build has multiple ways to significantly increase its strength, turning it into a handheld bomb by the time we're done upgrading it. The first of these upgrades is our slot 1 aspect Soul Invictus, which generates sunspots at the location of defeated enemies in the case of all solar ability and scorched enemy final blows, and at the location of all Hammer of Soul impacts. A sunspot is a pool of fire that lives on the ground, damaging and scorching any enemies that pass through it. However, given that you are a Solar Titan, you thrive off of these pools of fire, as when you walk through them, you gain the restoration buff, longer supers, and increased grenade and melee regeneration. Now, while sunspots only last on the ground for 6 seconds, if you are standing in them, that duration is extendable for up to 20 seconds. And these sunspots will become increasingly easier to create with our second aspect, Roaring Flames, which most know grants a stacking buff on solar ability kills that increases the damage of all of your solar abilities, capping out at 3 stacks for a 73% damage buff to all abilities. However, what a lot of folks don't know is that while you are buffed by Roaring Flames, all of your regular melee punches apply 30 stacks of Scorch and count as powered melee hits. This is massive because if you are in a situation where you accidentally lose your hammer due to either being unable to find it on the ground or definitely not throwing it off of a cliff, you can continue to maintain Roaring Flame stacks and create sunspots by defeating enemies with your regular melee punch, which, since it counts as a powered melee hit, will subsequently count as a solar ability and will thus refresh the stacks of your Roaring Flames and proc Soul Invictus to generate a sunspot on kills. And that second one is super important because, as we mentioned before, standing in sunspots will grant you the 5-second Soul Invictus buff to increase your grenade and melee energy regeneration, helping you to reacquire your hammer much more quickly in those situations that you accidentally lose it. Do me a huge favor and please consider subscribing to my channel if you did not know that about Roaring Flames before watching this video. Now, this hammer is going to do even more damage with the exotic armor piece of choice for this build, the Syntheseps Exotic Titan Gauntlets, which grant the Biotic Enhancement Enhancements buff for 8 seconds when surrounded by 3 or more enemies, increasing your super damage by 50% and your melee damage by 200%. Now, right out of the gate, Syntheseps does give diminishing melee damage buff returns when stacked with the 73% ability damage buff from 3 stacks of Roaring Flames. However, it is still an approximate 134% damage increase on top of Roaring Flames, making it well worth it, considering that Biotic Enhancements is always active due to this build encouraging a playstyle that always has you up close and personal with groups of enemies. Altogether, Biotic Enhancements and a fully stacked Roaring Flames buff will result in an overall 299% damage increase to your hammer throws. And all of those hammer throws will also help out all of the guns in the fire team as well through our first fragment, Ember of Torches, which grants the radiant buff to all nearby allies, including yourself, on powered melee hits, which is basically every single second of this build. Fragment number 2 in the Ember of Solace will increase the duration of all solar buffs, like Radiant from the Ember of Torches, and Restoration from our Soul Invictus Sunspots. Our third fragment will significantly increase our damage output towards tanky enemies and bosses in the Ember of Ashes, which increases the amount of Scorched stacks applied to enemies from all of our abilities, most notably our Sunspots, for significantly more ignitions and thus more damage. And for our final fragment slot, it depends entirely on what activity you are running. In group activities like raids and Grandmasters, I'd urge you towards the Ember of Benevolence for significantly increased grenade, melee, and class ability regeneration whenever applying solar buffs to allies, which is quite frequent thanks to radiant applications from the Ember of Torches. If, however, you are running a solo activity, like a solo flawless dungeon, I'd instead recommend the Ember of Searing to refund melee energy and generate a FIRESPRITE on scorched enemy defeats. This is good not only due to the additional grenade energy that FIRESPRITEs grant on pickup, but also to give you another method to quickly recover your throwing hammer in lost situations, thanks to your scorching uncharged melees from Roaring Flames. As for the rest of your abilities, personally, I roll with fusion grenades for raids and healing grenades for solo dungeons and Grandmaster Nightfalls. Now, to round things out, we've got our mod setup, which is significantly more simple than most mod configurations for most builds. You'll obviously want heavy-handed on the gloves to generate orbs of power on every powered melee final blow. Additionally, you'll also want hands-on on the helmet for additional super energy gains on every powered melee final blow. Your orb of power pickups will grant you stacks of armor charge to fund emergency reinforcement on the chest for a surge of temporary damage reduction when your shields are broken. After that, it's double impact induction on the gloves for a big chunk of grenade energy when dealing melee damage, which with this build is obviously all the time. Finally, I like rocking a copy of Outreach on my class item for a bump to melee ability energy on class ability cast, perfect to fast forward your hammer cooldown if you lose it. I know most might think 1-2 finisher would be solid here, however, I found it to be completely unnecessary due to the fact that I could always reacquire my lost hammer in about 5 seconds, thanks to Soul Invictus, Outreach, and the Ember of Benevolence or Searing. Other than that, the world is your oyster. You can roll with stuff like Heavy Ammo Finder on the helmet, Resists on the chest, Surges on the boots for boss DPS phases, and really whatever you like on the class item. To me, it just goes to show you how strong this build is in the sheer fact that there isn't any specific mod setup that buffs it up to be significantly better than it already is. As for stats, you'll want to have the usual max resilience and discipline, but aside from that, no stat really matters too much with this build, and the execution of this build is pretty much the same story. I know it sounds too good to be true with a build this strong, but the key to success really is to just run in, throw your bonk hammer at everything that moves, do that a few more times, do that a few more times, do that a few more times, and then go home with all your loot. And after that, all that's left to do is check out the Destiny Item Manager and Mobalytics written guide links down in the description, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video, and go and bonk some stuff in Destiny. I'll see you in the live stream. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a great day.